Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? We're taking a look today at a book that Marvel put the full weight of its marketing might behind in 1994 for like a full 3 seconds before it got distracted by something shiny. We're looking at Generation X #1. So if you grew up in the 90s, you probably recognize this title. I mean, the marketing was everywhere in 1994. So first we're going to go into the history of it a little bit. If you want to skip ahead to the comic itself, I put chapter breaks in the description. Feel free to use those. So for those sticking around, Generation X starts out with New Mutants, which probably shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, Generation X is very clearly a New Mutants book for the 90s. But the way it came about is fairly interesting because it starts in 1993 with Bob Harras approaching Scott Lobdell about just putting out a New Mutants one-shot. That's it. That's all they needed. And the reason they wanted something specifically with New Mutants was because the trademark hadn't been used since 1991 with New Mutants #100. For those who don't know, the way trademarks work is basically on a use it or lose it basis. So once you establish a trademark, you retain ownership of that trademark as long as you keep defending it by continually using it, by putting out products that have that name attached to it. And if you go too long without using a trademark, basically anybody can use it once the window has passed. I think with publishing in the 90s, it was probably like 2 or 3 years. Some things get prioritized more than others, and I mean, New Mutants, it was a huge name during the 80s. It had been around for a decade at that point. There was no reason to go letting the trademark expire, particularly when X books were the hottest they had ever been. Like, in addition to the comics doing as well as they ever had, the cartoon was also up and running. And of course, you had toy lines attached to that, you had all the merchandise. You certainly didn't want to let an X-related book expire. These days, it's pretty easy to maintain a trademark. All you got to do is put out a new trade paperback, put out a new facsimile. You can put out a one-shot if you want. You can do a new figure or something, anything that has the name emblazoned across it. In 1993, collections and reprints weren't quite as popular. They were still kind of new ground. They were in use, but they weren't widespread. So the easiest thing by far was just to put out a single issue. The difficulty was that Scott Lobdell wasn't particularly interested in doing a New Mutants issue. Like in 1993, New Mutants was tired. There was a reason nobody had put out a New Mutants issue in 2 years. He did come up with an idea that he liked quite a bit, which was much more in line with how he saw teenagers in 1993, which was much more alternative, let's say. Where you would take them away from the X-Mansion. Scott Lobdell thought that Professor X was kind of a shitty headmaster in that he was always prioritizing his old students and hopping off into space, and leaving whoever the young students were back at home to get attacked by the X-Men's enemies. And he didn't want established X characters just wandering into frame constantly. He wanted to establish it as its own book that stood on its own ground, which is admirable, I think. So he came up with a concept for a bunch of moody teenagers, and he came up with the admittedly inspired title of Generation X. That was a term that had been around for a while, but it had really just come into public consciousness in just a couple of years previous to when this book started getting developed. So he ran this idea by Bob Harras, and Bob Harras, I imagine, loved it. A new X book was always going to be a good idea around this time. It didn't exactly solve the problem of reestablishing the trademark, but Marvel was able to get around that by abusing the intend to use clause for 3 years, before eventually putting out the New Mutants Truth or Death 3-issue miniseries in 1997. So if you ever wondered why that book exists, that is it. It's just to renew the trademark. So in the meantime, Bob Harras and Scott Lobdell had an exciting new prospect on their hands that they were eager to start developing. Scott Lobdell decided he wanted Chris Bachalo for this particular project, and Bachalo had established himself most recently on Death, the High Cost of Living over at Vertigo. And Bachalo's style was very different from anything Marvel was doing at the time. It was much more in tune with the Vertigo style. It had a bit more of an independent feel, it didn't have that glossy superhero sheen, which was kind of what Scott Lobdell was looking for. And Marvel was kind of scrambling to get high-profile artists back in its stable, because, of course, their stock of high-profile artists had been massively depleted the year before. When all of the biggest superstar artists they had accumulated over the previous years that had just been making them a metric shit ton of money, all decided to walk out the door and form their own company called Image Comics. So to try and entice Chris Bachalo from DC, where he was happy doing his weird alternative titles, over to Marvel, which was in a position of weakness, and of course was known for almost exclusively doing glossy superhero stuff, which he didn't really want to do at the time. Marvel negotiated with him a ridiculously one-sided contract, where he would be guaranteed top-tier page rates, which would effectively mean he couldn't get fired from the book. He also had an unprecedented royalty clause written in, that was tied directly to the number of issues sold, and the first issue would go on to sell like 1 million copies eventually. So if Marvel pushed this book as much as it sounded like they were going to, he would essentially get a very hefty signing bonus. And in addition to this, he also got some measure of creator control. Him and Scott Lobdell were never going to get creator ownership exactly, but the royalties were important, and being able to say what could be done with the characters, that was pretty attractive too. So once he got started, he came up with a bunch of characters, and he kind of made a point of staying away from those glossy superhero type characters, which was what Marvel marketing wanted. You know, they wanted clean looking superheroes that they could package into toys. Chris Bachalo didn't get any money from that specifically, so he had no reason to do that, and I think he probably enjoyed coming up with characters that went expressly against that. So while there are a couple of characters that are kind of peace offerings to Marvel marketing, like Synch and M, the characters Chris Bachalo was most interested in, most of which he featured prominently on the cover, were Husk, whose power is that she can pull off her old skin to reveal a new form underneath. There was Chamber, whose lower jaw and chest cavity are missing and constantly sparking. And there was Skin, whose whole thing is that he just has way more skin than he needs. And yeah, I think Chris Bachalo had a little bit of fun featuring these guys most prominently on the cover of Generation X #1, at the expense of the more traditional looking characters. So these new characters, these new ideas, got dropped into the current storyline, which was the Phalanx Covenant, as sort of a tease for the upcoming series, where Banshee and the White Queen were going to be the headmasters of this New Mutants type iteration. And I think even at this time, Chris Bachalo was probably already known as one of those guys who just can't get an issue done on time. You know, he had worked for Marvel at least once before on Ghost Rider 2099, so they would have been familiar with him. And in the lead up to Generation X, they gave him a pretty long runway to try and get a bunch of issues under his belt so that they could hit the ground running and give him some time before the monthly schedule caught up with him. And once it looked like they were going to be ready to release the book in late 1994, the Marvel marketing machine went to work with advertising, with features in Wizard, and with collector's edition preview issues to try and build hype to make issue 1 as big a sales monster as they could manage. Those collector edition previews in particular were interesting because it was part of a 3-pronged attack to really make sure they covered their bases. So for retail outlets, they put out the Generation X Collector's Preview, which had snippets of the story as well as behind the scenes sketches, all sorts of stuff to try and build hype. They also had the Generation X Convention Preview, which was essentially the same thing, maybe slightly different content and packaged differently. That was the most important thing, for distribution specifically at conventions. On top of those, they also put out the Generation X Collector's Preview, which had a different cover and I believe some black and white artwork so they could say, again, it was behind the scenes stuff. That one seems to be almost impossible to get a hold of these days. And of course, they also put out the Generation X Ashcan, because that was what you did in 1993. Again, very similar to all the other material they were putting out at this time with all the other different kinds of previews. But the combination of all of these, as well as all the word of mouth they were putting out there with stuff like features in Wizard, kind of built up the hype to a fever pitch. So by the time issue 1 actually came out, it did exactly what they hoped it would do and sold 1 million copies. The information I found says 650,000, but I think that's probably just counting retail numbers. This was still at a time when the newsstand was very active. So 1 million copies is the number claimed, which would of course mean that Chris Bachalo got a very nice bonus on that first issue. And it meant Generation X #1 was the most ordered comic for its month. It was the 7th most ordered comic for the entire year, which gives you an idea of how ridiculous print runs were in 1994. But while a top-selling first issue is a nice achievement, it doesn't necessarily mean anything long-term. It's whether or not you can maintain a top 10 position after that. And Generation X was able to do that. Issue 2, 3, and 4 were all still in the top 10 for their respective months. And then there's a weird little hiccup in that the Age of Apocalypse event happened, which kind of derailed the story for 5 months. So it seems like there was some kind of crossed wires there a little bit. Although I suppose really it's just kind of a prime example of the kind of short-term thinking that had become endemic at Marvel at that point in the 90s. Where it was just a matter of, okay, build up to a big event, get as much short-term cash out of that event as you can, move on to the next event. Doesn't matter really if those two events kind of clash and you maybe end up sacrificing the long-term health of the one title for the sake of another event. Because that could very possibly have been the result. You know, after just 4 issues, you sideline the entire title so that you can completely change the book to this dystopian future version where the characters and the tone don't really resemble the book that was starting to develop at all. You know, there's a very real likelihood that by the time you get back to the main story, you haven't established the book well enough to actually bring back return readers. That didn't end up being the case with Generation X. It did stay in that top 10 for quite a while, really. I think at least a year after that issue 1 came out, it was still a top 10 book. So really, that's more of a what if. It's just that the process was so wrong-headed. Anyway, the book did come out, so now we get to talk about it. So let's take a look at Generation X number 1. So here we go. Like I said, Marvel Marketing making sure you notice this book with the shiniest cover on the rack. Wraparound as well, of course. Full chromium, embossed, the works. And also, like I said, all the weird-looking characters front and center with the normal superhero types kind of tucked in the background. You get Skin up here. Nobody wants Skin at the front of an issue, except maybe Chris Bachalo. You get Chamber here. Again, I don't think Marvel Marketing was too happy about that, but Bachalo doesn't care. No, who else doesn't care, I think, is Marvel Readers. Because damn, that's a cool-looking character. Good luck trying to make a toy based on that, though. And the villain M-Plate, who's another weird, messed-up-looking character that you can't possibly feature on a cartoon. Not unless you want to traumatize those kids. Marvel didn't usually want to do that. And then in the background, we get Gateway from the Australian Outback era. We get Monet St. Croix, we get Sync, there's Husk. Jubilee, I should have mentioned, actually, in the intro. Jubilee was kind of a big factor in this. She's kind of the bridge character because, of course, she got pretty heavily featured in the X-Men cartoon. So it was important to get her in here to try and attract those casual readers. And then in the back, we get the White Queen and the Banshee, the only two who are kind of recognizable old-school X-Men characters. But it's a great-looking cover. I do love the design for M-Plate. He's all wrinkles and weird tech and, like, the Snuffleupagus tubes. All the weird spiky hair and everything. It's a great looking character. We can also see that they've got these Generation X kind of standard issue X-Men type uniforms for the most part. They're pretty much all wearing them, which they're not going to do a whole lot at the beginning of the run here, because that's not a focus that Scott Lobdell and probably Chris Bachalo really want to do. So in the interior of the comics, most of the characters are usually going to be wearing just street clothes. And they often don't go by their code names, they go by their, secret identities, I suppose. But yeah, great looking spread. Honestly, kind of reminiscent of Uncanny X-Men number 1. I'm assuming that was intentional. No real equivalent for Beast swinging in on a pair of monkey bars attached to nothing, but that is a little bit difficult to justify in the 90s. It's tough to replicate that Kirby energy sometimes. So let's get into it here. Oh shit, yeah, there's all sorts of attachments in this thing. Okay, so we're going to start things off here with pretty much a splash page on Paige Guthrie. This is Husk. Paige Guthrie, of course, is the sister of Sam Guthrie, who was Cannonball back in New Mutants. So there's a little bit of continuity going on there, I suppose. Our creative team is going to be Scott Lobdell and Chris Bachalo, of course. The inker on this is going to be Mark Buckingham. This was Chris Bachalo's guy at the time. Lettered by Comic Craft, colored by Il Buce and Electric Crayon. I haven't heard of that one before. But this is, again, in the early days of digital color, where there's not a lot of focus on effects just yet. They're still kind of presenting pretty close to a 4-color look. Like, this wouldn't have looked too out of place back in 1991. A little bit better, not drastically, and not grotesque just yet. And the dialogue it's kind of typical for Scott Lobdell, really. This is all kind of wool gathering about evolution. Because, of course, this is a team of mutants, so that's a topical point of discussion. I think anybody who's watched a few videos of mine about comics that were written by Scott Lobdell probably know I'm not a fan of Scott Lobdell. I think he's pretty much Marvel's version of Eric Stevenson, where he's not particularly imaginative in terms of plot development, and he has a tendency to just fill up the page with, narration or dialogue that usually doesn't really convey any meaning. It's just there to fill space. That's his job, and he is pretty good at that job. But if you want memorable comics, like Scott Lobdell isn't really your guy usually, in my experience. So we are starting out with Paige here, and she's getting in her early morning jog, which Jubilee isn't too happy about. She doesn't like having to get up before 7 in the morning. She's a mall rat kid. She's still a teenager at this time. But Paige is a farm girl, so that makes some sense. But we can see already here from the art that this is going to look very different from your standard issue X book. We're not too far off from issue 1 of the Cable ongoing series, where Art T-Bear was instructed to make his pages look as much like Jim Lee as possible. It's not quite style over substance. Like I said, this is just before the Age of Apocalypse crossover. So the artists you usually get are guys like Joe Madureira or Andy Kubert or Adam Kubert, for that matter. You'd probably rather Adam Kubert, really, if we're getting down to it. John Romita Jr. is probably in that mix fairly often. You know, guys who can at least pull off that bombastic kind of style. This, at least at the start here, looks quite a bit more like a Vertigo book, with high levels of detail, but not necessarily the kind of detail that I think Marvel readers are used to, which is like details on the figures, or dramatic lighting, or tech maybe. Instead, we get all sorts of background detail, like frigging leaves. I think this is just to show that this is autumn. You know, this is like contextual background detail. It's not something you would normally get. And we're still kind of rattling on and on and on and on, because that's how Scott Lobdell usually rolls, which I guess can have some benefits if he can lock down the voices of characters. You know, having them natter back and forth constantly, you can get a feel for their personalities. I don't think it always works out. I think a lot of the time it does end up just looking like filling space, like I said. But I mean, given how popular this book was when it came out, I'm guessing the kids didn't care too much. So after her jog, Paige here is going to demonstrate her mutant power, because she's all sweaty and stuff, so she's just going to fix that by pulling off her old skin and replacing it with an unsweaty version of herself underneath. Her power is she can change her composition or something when she does that. So she can be like metal or maybe rock or something. I don't know exactly what the deal is. But they found an interesting way to just make it much more functional than that. And Jubilee is grossed out every time she does it. Which is fine. I kind of dig that, to be honest. Like I said, that's character stuff. And again, Chris Bachalo is showing Jubilee not coping well with being up early in the morning by having her out here in her yellow, Carrie Kelly coat, but with like a nightgown underneath and like fuzzy bear slippers. And for the big shot of Husk using her power for the first time, we get like the closest thing to an anchor image we've gotten so far in this. I think if you're unfamiliar with the character, it wouldn't be 100% clear what exactly is going on, so Scott Lobdell has to explain, of course. It's a nice looking shot, though. You do get a fair bit of heavy shadow here, as well as quite a bit of cross-hatching all over the place. That's kind of a Chris Bachalo thing, too. So they're going to head back to the boarding house, I think. I think the deal is that they're staying in the old Hellions boarding house. Because, of course, one of their headmasters is the White Queen, Emma Frost, who was running her own New Mutants type school for evil mutants. That was the Hellions. And then they all got slaughtered by somebody, which was instrumental in turning her towards being one of the X-Men. But, nobody's at that boarding house anymore, so might as well use it for this new book. And then their conversation gets invaded by M, this is Monet St. Croix, who is, like I said, kind of an olive branch to the marketing team by making a conventionally attractive X character. I mean, she even wears her uniform at 7 a.m. here. She wears, a baggy sweater over it, but she has the uniform on. Of course, they also compensated for this by making her a rich, snobby bitch that nobody on the team likes. Interesting shot to introduce her, too. Like, very large drawing of the character herself, like stretching her out beyond the panel borders, doing kind of a fisheye effect thing with the background behind her here. That's an interesting choice. I mean, it works. It definitely calls attention to the character. Again, more of those inserts. Oh, well. So they head back to the building. The building is called Xavier's. Okay. Where Banshee's waiting for them. Of course, he's the other primary headmaster. He's basically there to act as good cop when Emma Frost inevitably switches to bad cop. And kind of, act as babysitter, keep her in line, that kind of thing. And as they're walking in, M asks Banshee if it's okay if she's had a few personal belongings brought over, to furnish her room with. And he's like, yeah, no problem. And of course, it's a series of trucks full of who the fuck knows what. Which Banshee replies with dough. Because it's 1994. I'm pretty sure the Simpsons are kind of past their best before date at this point. But I suppose that's all right. So now we're going to do a quick cut to the coolest looking new character. Of course, this is Chamber, who's flying into the area because he's just been accepted to the new school here. And he travels around with a scarf up over his nose, which of course attracts a fair bit of attention. Get a little girl here who's looking back at him constantly. So he kind of, pulls the scarf down a little bit and get all sorts of sparks flying up for a second, just to kind of scare her into turning around. Kind of fun reaction from the kid, actually, where she's like, that guy has some kind of bionuclear psionic biokinetic field inside him. And her mom goes, that's his business, Dinah. Now turn around and finish your calculus. So that's fun. I'll give Scott Lobdell credit on that one. That's a good little sequence. And from there, we're going to switch back to Xavier's, although they're not going to tell us that just yet. This is essentially the new version of the Danger Room, where we're going to get introduced to Sync. And you'll notice that we're getting, large shots of our characters every time we need to introduce them. We got the splash page, page to start with, and then the splash of Jubilee. Then we get a Monet Saint Croix here. Banshee, well, you just get kind of the top corner. But then the big cool shot of Chamber, and then Sink here. So that's obviously intentional on the part of Chris Bachalo. It does mean you get like the cool shots of your characters in rapid succession right off the top of the bat, which is a good strategy for starting off a book with basically unknowns. This is about the only one we've gotten so far that actually looks like a superhero character. Kind of a basic looking costume design, I suppose, but Chris Bachalo throws in a whole bunch of black in the figure here to kind of compensate for that. It ends up looking pretty great. Nice page design too, with the circular panel up top and then all the other panels branching down off of that. So he's in battle with Skin. Again, Skin gets his own kind of dedicated anchor image. So yeah, his deal is that he's got too much skin, so it kind of gives him not quite shapeshifter powers, but kind of along those lines. And Sink's power is that he kind of photocopies the powers of people that he gets in contact with. I think it's a bit more than that. Like if he maintains contact, then he copies personality traits and that kind of thing as well. But, you know, like Skin here kind of wraps Sink up with his big kind of boneless arms, and Sink responds by wrapping Skin up in return. So they're just kind of tying each other in knots here. It's an interesting early action sequence. All right, from there we're going to cut to another part of the boarding house where Banshee is going to introduce the new danger room properly. It's basically just like a habitat that's been set up inside the school. Or as Jubilee calls it here, the Danger Grotto. Again, not a bad line, really. I think this is one of the better things I've read by Scott Lobdell. I've been kind of waiting for something to show me that Scott Lobdell is a decent writer, because he got enough work in the 90s, and I hadn't found it up until now. This is probably the best thing I've seen him write so far. In terms of events, we're following a pretty traditional kind of path for a new book, where you one by one introduce your characters, and, you know, set up a couple of early, like, light conflicts, like personality conflicts, before you move on to the inevitable action sequence. But yeah, as Banshee's explaining the place, saying, you know, it's as safe can be, Skin and Sink come crashing through the window, again, all knotted up in each other. Apparently they're not supposed to train against each other. Banshee's like, where the hell did you even get that stupid idea? And that's when Emma Frost comes in saying, that would be me. Yeah, we are focusing more on the kids and not so much the headmasters in this situation. You know, they're going to be in the comic fairly often, but they're not going to be the focus. So I think that's probably a smart decision. Interesting design for Emma Frost here, where she's not exactly wearing the lingerie that the character started out in, but her outfit still kind of suggests lingerie. And of course, there's going to be some conflict between Banshee and Emma as well, because they're both headmasters with essentially equivalent amount of authority, and they both got very different ideas about how you run a school like this, which is not a bad way to go. Again, when you're setting up this kind of book with a bunch of teenagers who are naturally going to be very unsure about what kind of actions they should be taking, and then you want to give them different courses of actions based on who they're getting their orders from. And I guess by doing that, you kind of set up the natural suspicion of, is Emma Frost going to revert to her villain ways? Because it's still very new for her to be working for the X-Peoples. All sorts of storylines you can spin off of that. Okay, from there, we're going to cut to Logan International Airport in Boston. And we're not supposed to know who this guy in the back here is just yet, but this is the villain. This is M-Plate. And he's hanging out waiting for Chambers' plane to land. Sitting here just chatting with his little goblin-looking chauffeur. Cool-looking car to start things off with. Like, I mean, really well-proportioned, really. Like, good textures and everything. That's a great-looking car. No, all these cars. Chris Bachalo kind of goes out of his way to draw, like, photorealistic-looking cars. It's nice to see. I did the Craven's Last Hunt video not too long ago. And it was interesting seeing in that how much attention Mike Zeck put on, like, figures and, you know, a lesser extent backgrounds, and then way lesser extent on cars. Seems like Chris Bachalo is willing to spend, you know, a ridiculous amount of attention on just about everything, really. So having introduced all of our characters, having introduced the Danger Room, having set up a couple of personality conflicts, our first orders of business are kind of out of the way. So now we got to move on to the next bit, which is Banshee's going to drive off to the airport to go and pick up Chamber. And he's going to get Jubilee and Sink to come with him. Monet is not going to join them. She says she wants to hang back and familiarize herself with the campus. I think just she doesn't want anything to do with the other kids that much. Yeah, look how different all these faces look. These look great. Like Chris Bachalo he's not exactly young anymore. He's like 28, 29 when this is coming out. But he obviously has a ridiculous amount of talent that he's honed to a crazy degree. Being able to maintain the models for the faces from panel to panel, different angles, all that, it's not particularly easy to do. It also doesn't really line up with what Marvel usually looks like. Usually if faces look the same from panel to panel, it's because all of the faces in that book kind of look the same. See Andy Kubert. So after Banshee and the kids leave, Monet is going to wander around the grounds a little bit, and she's going to stumble upon Gateway. I'm guessing that Gateway got attached to this team during the Phalanx Covenant crossover, because it's not really explained why he's here. And seeing how he never talks to anybody, he really is just kind of analogous to a piece of equipment a lot of the time. Kind of like Void and Wildcats. A bit more personality than that, though, I would say. And Monet kind of natters on at him for a second before deciding that he's warning her about somebody returning. And from there, we're going to cut to M-Plate. So kind of a implied link there that I believe gets extrapolated on. I read a lot of the later X-Factor issues, I think the third series by Peter David. The one that ended up with Guido as the King of Hell. So I think I know what the implied link is between the two. I'm not 100% sure, though. It's been a little while since I read those. So now we're on M-Plate here, and he's walking through the airport, looking like just a walking nightmare. Like, Chris Bachler really came up with an interesting design for his villain. And the reason he's able to walk through without, obviously nobody notices him, because if you saw that, you'd freak out. He's apparently out of dimensional sync, so can't be perceived in like regular space. But again, all those like differences in the background characters here, like everybody kind of has their own unique look. Oh, and I guess you're allowed to smoke in the airports back then too. So he's walking through, and he's going to be searching for Chamber, who's disembarking just about now. So the deal with M-Plate is that he's basically like an energy vampire. I believe he's got a thing too where, once he absorbs their powers, he can reproduce them. That's not going to be revealed in this issue. I think that's a later thing. And I don't know if it's a temporary thing or if it's more long-term. But he is specifically looking for mutants. You get the impression he can absorb the essence of just about anybody, really, but mutants are obviously much more potent. And he's not expecting Banshee and the kids here to be waiting for Chamber. He doesn't even know why Chamber is coming to the States. He thinks it's a little weird. Some of his dialogue does come off as kind of flippant and childish, but it's not too different from the way Scott Lobdell just writes characters. So you don't know if that's because the character is actually younger or if that's just Scott Lobdell writing what should be a serious character as sounding like a teenager. But through the crowd, he can see Chamber approaching. He just kind of shows up as this like wave of energy coming toward him. And he gets like tunnel vision, just starts advancing on him, not really paying attention to anybody around him. And because he's out of sync, he's able to just walk right up to him and, latch onto him. Yeah, all these close-ups on M-Plate look absolutely fantastic. Chris Bachler really going out of his way to make him like as creepy a villain as he can come up with. Oh, more ads. Be plenty of ads in this thing. So he grabs onto Chamber and starts feeding off of him, but immediately gets blasted in the back here by Banshee. And now we're going to get to more of a traditional superhero fight. We do see things from M-Plate's view here as he realizes that they're also mutants. They also have these kind of auras. That's their energy field. And, it's quite a bit less pronounced than Chamber's, which kind of fills his area of the room. So he does the thing where he's absorbed some of Chamber's power. He absorbs some of Banshee's blast, so he's able to kind of turn those into an energy blast that he can send back at them. But Sync jumps in the way, and he's going to try and absorb that. There's kind of a similarity of powers here that's like, it feels like there's a little bit too much similarity with some of these characters. It's tough sometimes coming up with a lot of interesting types of powers and personalities that are all very distinct from each other. M-Plate here is still latched on to Chamber through the whole thing, I think. But Chamber's able to power through and, unleash his power. Kind of an awesome looking shot here as M-Plate just gets like caught in a maelstrom. And we get the big reveal on Chamber. So he also gets his own dedicated anchor image where the shroud over his mouth has been pulled away. And he's got this energy field where his like lower face should be. Apparently when his mutant power kicked in, it like destroyed the lower half of his face and I guess his chest. Seems to have gotten through it okay though, and it is an awesome looking character design. And they appear to be at some kind of a standoff because Emplate can still absorb this kind of energy. I don't know, we're at a point now, like, you want your villain to be more powerful than your heroes. Because it makes your heroes have to either work together to defeat the villain or, come up with clever solutions or something like that. But it does kind of feel like he's just a villain who can negate any superhero's powers. I don't know, I'm sure there's interesting ways around that. But anyway, yeah, he's about to blast him again. He's got these little, mouths on his hands here for the vampire suction shit. Again, it's pretty gross. Nice character design. But he gets kind of bushwhacked when the rest of Generation X get teleported in by Gateway. So now he's going to get outnumbered. So it kind of evens the odds. That's fun stuff. I do like the way Chris Bachalo and Mark Buckingham are rendering the teleport effect here. That's pretty cool. A lot of white media in there, I think. Husk runs in first. I don't know exactly what she thinks she's going to do, but this is more, I think, coming up with an interesting way to use her power. Because she runs up and, she's just got, regular person strength. She hasn't changed her genetic makeup to be anything stronger than what she is. So Emplate just kind of slashes at her here. They're going to attempt to teleport her back, but then Jubilee decides to, overcome her gross out factor by pulling off Husk's skin and basically replacing her injured form with a fully whole form, which, like I said, is kind of a clever way to get around that. It still doesn't answer the question of what she thought she was doing. And then we've got our big standoff page here with our team against our villain, kind of reminiscent of the cover. And Emplate decides this is more trouble than it's worth, I guess. So he just kind of teleports out, and does a "we shall meet again" as he fades away. Monet's about to run after him, but she all of a sudden stops in her tracks because Emma gets in her brain and basically shuts her down for a second. And still got that smug little smile that she's had through the entire thing. She is, I guess, designed to be just kind of inherently a little bit hateable. And then at the end here, all sorts of emergency personnel start filing in. They don't seem to notice all the weird people in the red spandex because Emma is kind of psychically making them invisible. And we end with Jubilee approaching Chamber, saying, "Welcome to Generation X." Oh, we got to get an epilogue in here with Emplate, though. I suppose that's all right. He's probably the coolest looking character in the entire issue. But he didn't get enough energy through that fight. He only partially absorbed Chamber. He also expended some energy when he was blasting back at Generation X. So he's going to go and feed on somebody that he usually keeps prisoner, only to find out that she has escaped, which presents a problem for him because this is his usual source of nourishment. So this part's confusing for me because, like I said, I read later X Factor issues where, at this point, we're setting up mysteries to be unraveled later, and I've read issues after all of the mysteries have been solved and are referring back to this piecemeal. So I'm not going to go and break any spoilers or anything because I don't 100% understand what the answers are. So anyway, then we're going to cut back to the boarding house here, where Generation X are going to have a victory kind of celebration where they just kind of go, yay, and Skin fires up a victory dart. I mean, on the one hand, it's oh, that's so edgy, but it is actually a little bit edgy for Marvel in the early 90s. Your teenagers aren't usually going to be smoking. That's not really the message corporate wants to send. And hey, Chamber gets to walk around without his scarf on. He's very creepy while he does it, but again, cool representation for his power here. I love the look that Chris Bachalo and Mark Buckingham are coming up with for him. And interesting job by the colorist to not just stick with the flame look for the crackling energy signature. Oh, that is another thing with Chamber. Because his jaw is gone, he can only communicate telepathically, apparently. I think facilitated by the White Queen. And at the end, Gateway wants to talk to Banshee, apparently, and he does actually say one word. He says penance, which is kind of crazy for Gateway because he doesn't usually speak at all. And that's when, we got to get through the ads to get there, I guess. That's when some woman teleports directly in front of them, and that is Penance. So this is the character that Emplate had chained up in his lighthouse. And that's where we're going to end this issue. We get a little bit of kind of pseudo-sketchbook stuff at the end here. Some stuff that Chris Bachalo came up with. It's nice to have this in the issue one. And then, there's our back cover. Again, very nice. So yeah, that's Generation X. It's not a bad first issue. It kind of does what it needs to. Introduces the team and spends a decent amount of time on each character, kind of separating them from each other. so nobody really gets lost in the shuffle. Spend a lot of time on this new threat that they're probably going to be dealing with. That's going to be their primary adversary. Set up a couple of mysteries with penance at the end here. We don't know a whole lot about M-Plate other than what he does and that he seems to want to destroy Generation X. And, hey, we got a decent fight scene, I guess, in an airport. So you kind of tick a lot of the boxes there. It takes a little while meandering around to get there. Or I don't know, maybe it just feels like it because the dialogue feels like it gets very wordy. But that's kind of typical for Scott Lobdell. So I guess, if you're buying this and you know who Scott Lobdell is, then you're used to that style and you're walking into it knowing what you're going to get. In terms of the art, I do like Chris Bachalo's style quite a bit. I will say this is, I don't know, the word that comes to mind is underwhelming, which I don't think is fair, really. More, maybe unassuming is a better word. Because there are a lot of pages in this. This is like 32 pages for some reason. Didn't have to be, but okay. And I guess maybe I was expecting, I don't know, a little bit more detail or more creative page designs. And we didn't get a lot of super creative page designs. There's a few tricks here and there. Like you look at this sequence here, where Generation X first shows up, going with kind of a mirrored page layout. That's all right. When Husk jumps into the fray here, pop her out of the panel border. That's okay too. And the whole thing with dedicated anchor images for the different characters is nicely executed. Everything is well done, for sure. I think maybe I've just got a high bar of expectation for Chris Bachalo. And it's it didn't quite get there maybe. But then again, he is also trying, I think, to accelerate his pace a little bit from how fast he would like to go. Not too much faster, mind you. He did get a long lead-up time to draw these first 4 issues. And then, of course, we dove immediately into Age of Apocalypse, so we had to draw the 4 issues of Generation Next. And then he gets in another couple of issues before he starts falling behind. And he falls behind hard. There's an extended period from issue 7 through issue 17 where it's all fill-in artists. And then Chris Bachalo comes back for a 5-issue stint. Then he's gone again for another 5 issues, comes back for another 5 issues. And that's him done on the title, apart from a couple of covers. So by issue 32, there have been 16 total issues drawn by Chris Bachalo, and that was all you were going to get. And there wasn't a whole lot Marvel could do to complain, of course, because Chris Bachalo had negotiated such a favorable contract that he was able to take as long as he wanted, and Marvel couldn't do a whole lot about it other than just slot in fill-in artists and hope he could come back as soon as possible. Doesn't seem to have hurt the book at all. Issue 32, so first issue after Chris Bachalo is done, is still the 12th most ordered book for the month that came out. So to maintain a top 10 presence, basically for the first 3 years of the book's life, is actually extremely impressive. Even after the first few issues after Bachalo leaves, the title doesn't get a regular penciler again until issue 36, when Terry Dodson comes on, who is a good fit, I think, in that he also doesn't have a very action-heavy kind of style. He does have more of a DC look, really. Still very stylish, though, and the kind of guy who can carry a title as a name artist, and is a little bit better about keeping up with the schedule. He still would need fill-in artists from time to time, but it wasn't anywhere near as often as Chris Bachalo did. And yeah, like I said, he would stay on until issue 60. Even at issue 60, it's the 35th most ordered book for the month. It's fallen a bit, but it's still pretty highly ranked. And then after Terry Dodson leaves, it lasts for another 15 issues before finally getting shuttered. But yeah, for a book that was born out of, we need a New Mutants one-shot to maintain the trademark, you gotta say that it was kind of a crazy success, really. Honestly, way more than I would have thought. By the time this came out, I wasn't really buying very many superhero comics anymore. I was vaguely aware of Generation X. I did not realize what kind of popularity the book had, which was quite a bit, apparently. So I remember Generation X as a footnote. I would not be surprised if this was a lot of people's favorite book in the mid to late 90s. But yeah, as for this first issue here, it's pretty good. It does what it needs to do in terms of the story. The delivery method isn't quite to my taste, but, that's mostly just me. The art is very high quality throughout, doesn't look too much like a superhero book, even if the events are kind of superhero book anyway. I guess there was no real getting away from it when you're an X book. Oh, one more thing I guess I should mention, of course, is that Generation X led to one of the worst Marvel spin-off movies ever produced in the Generation X TV movie, where they had absolutely zero budget and some of the worst effects you've ever seen. How low was the budget? Their main villain was played by Matt Frewer. I love Matt Frewer, but he's just not the guy you get if you have proper leading villain money. I don't think anybody's ever been intimidated by Matt Frewer. Anyway, that's enough rambling about this thing. Time to wrap up. So thanks very much for watching, guys. If you got this far, don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe if you haven't already. If you're watching on mobile, you can always hit the hype button. And right about now, there should be a link coming up for my Patreon. You can check that out too if you like. But yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.